Okay. Uh, had to change my rig here a little bit, so I've got a new camera going and a new microphone going, which is supposed to be a bit better. And of course, the big ring orb up here for a light, so that every now and then you get that look in my glasses, or maybe I can get it right in the center of those things and kind of have that goofy ring sight going the whole time. But otherwise, things have been going well here. Very interested. We had another little snow since last week, about 5 inches, and we've got probably 6 or 8 inches coming over in the next 3 or 4 days this week. And uh, I get my vaccine Friday, so all things are going well. So sometime in early March, as soon as my new grandson gets his last shots, after however long it takes for him to have his regimen of shots, his probably the next day, his grandmother and I will appear on their front door, and we'll want to see our grandson and our granddaughter. So we haven't told them yet, but we'll kind of break that to them on the way. We're across town. We'll be over there in a little bit, okay? And so just so as you know, there are some things that take priority on everything else, and for grandparents, that's grandchildren. So just remember that as you go along, and you have your children, and you like for your grandparents to leave you alone for a little while. It's the basic role of grandparents to spoil the children, their grandchildren, and to offer them a way to put their parents in between things. So we'll see how all that goes. But anyhow, tonight there enough about me. Tonight there are two things that I really want to kind of focus on. One is to kind of wrap up things that I was talking about last week in terms of uh, general theories of leadership, after we talked about leadership modes. And you were supposed to go and try to take a look at environmental scans. Hopefully you got a chance to do that and to find the environmental scan material that might be in your school. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but there are some things about the leadership theories that we need to kind of put a wrap on, or at least highlight enough so that as you maybe read a little bit more deeply into it, you'll have some thoughts about things. One thing I do need to tell you, your first assignment that's due on the 19th, there's another formative assignment that was says TBA I think on the web page on As You Learn, but it's I think we talked about a more explicit date in class and maybe on the syllabus. The actual date of that second one, now that was a TBA, is now the 26th. So and maybe it would be smarter if I just pulled that up and we take a look. Let's go over here. Share that up for a second. This one that is listed as the reflective leader. We're going to try to get into the strategic plan stuff a bit this evening and see, how far we might get with that. That actual assignment will be due on the 26th. It's now showing TBA, but it will be due on the 26th of this month. And you have one that is coming up on the 19th. I do need to put up links for those for you to post them. I don't believe I have the link up, live links up yet. So as we get those up, I'll remind you of those things. This thing of the sit, sip, and the law, it's just a little quiz-like thing to make sure that you have um, an awareness of what the law says is required and what you can do and what you can't do. That will come up after we cover that content, which won't be for another couple of weeks anyhow, because next week is a week that you will be working asynchronously with your groups as you begin to put together begin the process of doing the group project. And so, next week's asynchronous, and then the week after that, I've put up all the content pieces and whether we're doing synchronous or asynchronous through the end of March. And I know there'll be some stuff that I'll need to do in April. And so it'll be, I'll get those live in the next few days too. So by the time we see each other again, you'll have everything up live on the As You Learn site. Any questions or comments or gripes, general complaints about life, whatever? Okay. So that's just a little heads up there to make sure that we're all up to speed. Now, a little bit about next week and the getting the groups together. There are 2 or 3 things that are important to know about that process. One, I really don't want the groups meeting without all participants in a meeting. So if you've got 4 people to participate, then you should have 4 people there. And that's an important thing about figuring out working with teams and working with groups, is that somebody needs to take charge, or as a group you need to figure out who you're going to put in charge, and somebody's in charge of scheduling stuff and working out to make sure that everybody can meet. And so there are some requirements that are just given if you're going to have an effective team or an effective group. And rather than me organize those groups, I'm leaving it up to you to organize those groups, because that's probably the way it should be. You don't really get a whole lot out of it by, me telling you, who's going to run the group and how you're going to do it, because it's entirely up to the group. It's just that it has to be a group decision as to how you organize it or how you run it. Any questions about that? Okay. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about this environmental scan notion. When you looked at the environmental scan, what did you think that it looked like compared to what you thought it might have looked like? Not everybody all at once.
Dr. Bolt, one thing that I noticed in looking at the data from my school was kind of a recurring issue that teachers seemed to note was the lack of time for everything from planning to just organizing resources, even professional development.
Mm-hmm.
And that in the working conditions survey, and then in a staff I guess it was as more or less some staff feedback that was given and put into an Excel form a few years ago. That seemed to be the common thread there, that time was, I guess in most schools, but was kind of that one sticking point that people really had issues with trying. I don't think only to manage that, but find time to make sure that we're organizing in a way that's successful for ourself and our school.
Yeah. Well, that's not an unusual complaint. I think that's been consistent in the teaching working conditions information. I've been looking at that stuff since I guess 2008 when they first formalized it. The first kind of years they came out, doing a little research on that, and one of the consistent elements all the way through has been time. And if you ask teachers in general, what their biggest complaint is, it is time. And more often than not, our inconsistent treatment of discipline issues. I mean, that seems to be a big one. Those are the two biggies. Uh, but here's here's sort of there. I think, well, in my mind, there are two issues there. One is certainly a time issue because there is never enough time. But the other one is sort of a prioritization issue that and issues in terms of school leadership because obviously you can't do all things and you can't be all things to all people. And so the notion of managing time, not only personally, but managing time within the building so that, you have the time to do those things that are the highest priority things to get done. And that's why this notion later of strategic planning is such a key concept of having mission statements and value statements and goals and things like that. Because if you don't have, focus, if you don't have a point to the spear, so to speak, if you have a blunt spear, you're never going to get anything done. If you have if the spear is a bit sharper and more pointed, then you know where to attack problems. But getting to figuring out what those problems are, figuring out what needs to be attacked first, is really a big part of this environmental scan and a big part of the strategic planning process, because you have to have a clear notion of where you are before you can have any idea of where you want to get to. I mean, if you don't have a starting point, then you don't know how far away the end point is. You don't know how much of a change has to occur. And so you don't want to dwell on looking back, but you do want to know at any moment given point in time, what is the snapshot that describes what the building looks like and what's going on in the building. And that's the environmental scan, or at least as much as it can be, because the data in that is some of it's very precise, some of it's not so precise. For example, the teacher working conditions, that thing was developed without any consideration as to validity or any reliability concerns. And the reliability scores on it can range from being very good to just middling. And there are some issues in it that you don't want to even, that are not even dealt with within that survey. For example, they've taken out most of the demographic questions. Now, there are some concerns that people had about, we don't want people to be able to figure out who's saying this or who's not saying this. But when you take demographics out of a survey like that, then that means that you can't readily look at issues of racial inequities or gender inequities or any of those things, because you don't have ageism, all those issues that may impact, climate within buildings. And if you don't have any way of kind of, putting a finger on one of those things, even if you keep it anonymous, you really kind of don't get at some of the core issues. And so, the data you have that deals with, some of the things you think are very precise. For example, the discipline referral data. I mean, we think that's very precise data, but the definitions of discipline within a building and even within individual teachers is quite different. And so you may have a standard set of definitions, but it's up to the teacher to make the decision of whether those apply or not in a given circumstance. And so you'll have some teachers that you may have, 50 discipline referrals during the year, and you all have other teachers that maybe have two. And I'm not sold on the notion that that's a big difference between how they handle a classroom. I think it's a big difference in how they rate certain discipline issues in terms of severity. And so, some people will do one or the other. And so there are some holes in that data that you have to be aware of. And so you can't read it as well as you would like to. And so it's important to have multiple people reading the data, multiple viewpoints. And so when you get ready to kind of look at that data and think about, okay, what does this say about where we go with a strategic plan? It's important to have different eyes and different voices in that mix, because people may see it slightly differently just because their context or their biases are one way or the other, and other people's are a different way. So it is really important to look at the data and read the data, but understand the limitations. Excuse me. Oh, good. I'm getting a vaccine Friday, and I must be catching it right now. So what the hell? Actually, it's just bacon bits off a potato I ate just a little while ago. I guess it's some of it didn't make it to the right place, so we're okay. But I'll survive. I've never heard anybody choking over bacon bits, so we're okay. I'm not sure you can do a virtual Heimlich, but maybe, I don't know. So anyhow, yeah, it's important to have those bits and pieces of data because they give you a framework to know where you're at, but at the same time, you have to know, there are some limitations to that data. Other folks, when you looked at data, your school's data, what did you see that may have surprised you or not surprised you, or was it consistent with your view of the school?
I'll speak to this. I've noticed that like we were really inconsistent with meeting goals. Like we might meet our goal this year, and then the very next year be back right where we were. And I mean, like I'm young enough where I don't really know what would cause that, but like for the past 5 years, it's met, not met, met, not met, and I was curious as to why that might be a.
Mm. Yeah, it's the boundary issue. you know when we have these goals, or when we set standards, you have to set them at a particular boundary, at a particular point. And around that boundary is kind of a margin of error that's got this normal shaped curve around it, bell shaped curve. I don't like bell, but normal shaped curve. And so no measurement is precise. There are reliability issues with all measurements, and when you do aggregate measurements, when you look at a whole group, a whole class or a whole school or whatever, what you get is an average point across that measurement. And so that may establish a goal or a place you want to get to, but individuals will respond in different ways. And so you may have a year where you had some good fortune, and a lot of people fell just on the plus side of the measurement, and the next year you have a lot of people that fell just on the negative side of the measurement. Now, the difference between one year to the next is probably not substantial, but it's just it's this boundary problem of wherever you put the boundary, you have to realize that individuals will perform on both sides of it. Now, more of them will perform, around the middle, but they could perform at both sides of it. And so you know, that's random. That's as much pure chance as anything. And then there's the other issue that if you've been in school, you know, much time at all, you realize that some classes just have a little higher wattage than other classes. You know, that you'll have a class that'll have a little bit more horsepower than the class before them, or a little bit less than the class before them, or I mean, each one of them is kind of unique. Even, you know, in class years. I mean, I can remember sitting in you know, a graduation exercise when I was teaching high school, and having an English teacher said, well, they did pretty well for a, you know, class that really wasn't all that bright. Now, I thought that was a little judgmental, but I could understand exactly what she was saying, because one class was, you know, you kind of challenge you every day in class teaching, and the next one it was like, oh, they're not challenging too much and they're not pushing the boundaries all that much. So, you know, it's there are some variations, just normal variations. So I'm not a big fan of comparing from year to year, but I know that politicians are and bean counters are. But you know, having that one side or the other of the boundary is really, from a purely measurement statistical point of view, not terribly meaningful. Now, if you're way above and then way below, that's a different story. But if you're around that boundary, you know, point or two above, point or two below, then, you know, chances are those kids are about the same. They just, you know, some of them had good luck one year and some of them had bad luck the next year. And, you know, that's kind of that whole boundary issue. Um, Other things that you saw when you looked at that thing?
I think when I was looking at it, we really pushed forward the last, I guess it was 2 years ago now, because we didn't have data last year, but we pushed forward and improved our letter grade, and we exceeded growth. And so when I was looking through here, I noticed all the awesome proficiencies from our English language learners, all of our subgroups. So I guess I'm kind of wondering why we didn't celebrate more. You know, like it was kind of a, we exceeded growth. Yay, let's move on. You know, like looking at this report card, it's actually really good. And I didn't realize how good it was until I did this. When I looked through everything, every specific thing.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, maybe it's time to up the goals. You know, maybe it's time to, you know, say, okay, we've kind of done pretty good. I would get a couple of years, you know, stream before I, you know, made that necessary decision. But yeah, maybe you up the goals. Maybe you decide, okay, we've kind of met where we are. Of course, we got a few kids that we need to still work with and remediate and get, you know, bring them up. But as a general rule, we're kind of where we wanted to be. All right, well, now maybe it's time to up the goals a little bit. That's a little bit of a dangerous thing. You know, one of the things that in measurement that we talk about, and now it's a part of the whole leadership theory notion, is this sort of Pygmalion thing. And you know, now that we're applying more of a business model to some stuff and things like that, that when you want people to perform better, you raise expectations. Well, that's not the way it works. I mean, you don't raise expectations to get people to perform better. You raise expectations because people have performed near the level that you wanted to get to, and now let's push beyond that. Let's go a little bit higher and see what happens. But sometimes we raise expectations just in the notion that if we raise expectations, people will do a better job or they'll perform better. And that's not the case. I mean, it really is kind of a backwards logic sort of thing you're trying to apply there. But yeah, I'm a believer in high expectations, but I'm also a believer in expectations that are reasonable for people to meet, and not high expectations just because they're high expectations. But see, in the business model, we just we set a goal and say we're going to improve sales by 5%. Now y'all go do it. Well, that's not the way learning works. And so the expectation game has to be very carefully played, I think. But yeah, maybe it's time. Or if you found that consistent over, if you looked at it over a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and find that you're consistently better than you thought you were doing, maybe it is time to up the ante a little bit. See if you can push people beyond that a little bit. And but you have to have teachers that are willing to do that. And sometimes there's this notion of resting on our laurels a little bit and catching our breath. Well, there is no catching your breath in schools. I mean, you take the next group and you take them as far as you can, and that's the nature of it. Other
Dr.
things.
Bolt, I'm down the mountain at Wilkesboro Elementary School.
Yep.
And I noticed that we have 21.4% beginning teachers as part of our makeup of our classroom teachers. And our biggest thing is we really need to get good teachers and keep good teachers. We're getting a lot of those one and dones that are coming out of Appalachian or wherever, and they're finding a placement at our school and then just moving on, or they're not planning routes really, which is a problem for us. So we've had a lot of turnover and we've had extremely inconsistent grade levels. So we're not really knowing what's working well for those grade levels, who's working well together, things like that.
Yeah, well, sometimes it may be that your focus has to be on recruiting and keeping good staff. If you have a very low, fairly low turnover, then maybe that's not as big a deal as long as student performance is maintained. But if you're having a high turnover, yeah, you can't implement much of anything because, by the time you spend professional development and, all those sorts of things, those quarter of your staff moves on the next year. It's kind of like, okay, now we're kind of starting over again. Maybe not exactly starting over, but it looks like we're starting over again because it's all new faces. I mean, you look around the room and, Wilkesboro is not that big a school system that you should be able to notice faces that you're familiar with. And, it's not like a Greensboro or something like that, but, if you're not having that retention, then yeah, that's probably an issue. That's probably one that would go on a strategic plan, I would think, is how do you get quality new staff, and then how do you retain them? The retaining part is always the more difficult part. And it's almost always tied to mentorship programs or retention programs or, things where you have ways of teachers, new teachers reaching out to experienced teachers, and you have, experienced teachers that are mentors to new teachers and stuff like that. I mean, there are lots of mentorship models out there that work really well, but if it's not on your priority list, then you tend not to spend much time with it. It's like they come in and get a day's orientation and then they're in the building. And most of the orientation is spent on benefits. And so it is, but there's lots of issues that could be in the school. It could be instructional. It can be, staffing. Maybe staffing is the big issue in Wilkesboro. And I mean, you're never going to have a consistent flow if you have a 20 or 25% turnover basically every year. Now, there'll be some years you have that because, the groups of teachers come in and then they retire and go out the door on the other side at a, regular time frame. But it is, some of the more transient communities, and Wilkesboro is a little bit of a transient community. Some of the more transient communities do have issues retaining people because people are coming there without roots. They don't have it's not like they're going getting their credentials and then they're coming home to teach. They don't, that's more prevalent in rural communities and smaller communities. you know, where it's likely that people will have closer community ties. But in a mid-size, you know, small city size, but mid-size sort of area, you know, it's not unusual for people not to have roots. And so, and it's a tough year. First year's a tough year. I mean, it's really, you're not going to get much of a social life built the first year because you don't know anybody and you're too busy. So it is, you know, maybe that's an issue. Maybe you need to think about that as you're thinking about developing your school improvement plan. That might be an element of it if you decide that you know, teacher retention is an issue. Yeah. Other thoughts, other observations of what you saw? Yeah. Be sure that you pay attention to this thing because you're going to want to look at this thing as you work on that school improvement plan project of yours, that big individual project of yours, because you have to, you know, you have to ground it in something, and you ground it in the data that you know, which is mostly this data that you've looked at in terms of you know, environmental scans. And so if you, for various reasons, haven't looked at the environmental scan, you certainly want to do that before you begin to think about and develop that school improvement plan. Okay. One other, yeah, I mentioned the Pygmalion thing, which is that establishing expectations really before determining that there's a real need for that or a real capacity to do that. I mean, just establishing higher expectations isn't going to make it happen. You have to have a support structure underneath it. The other problem that happens a lot is in leadership models is the problem attribution. And it is kind of what it sounds like, attribution. If you haven't read that yet in any of the reading material or whatever, that when you see someone that's not performing or has behaviors that are unusual for them, it's real easy to assign or attribute dispositional flaws to that. In other words, he's not doing a good job because he's lazy, or he's not doing a good job because he doesn't care about the kids, or she's not doing a good job because blah, 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 you know. And it's always important to, when you see an issue or you see a problem, to collect as much information as possible on that problem. And as much information as possible about the person, whether it's a student or a staff member or whatever, that's at the center of that problem. Because until you know all the elements around it, you don't know whether it's dispositional or whether it's situational. Now, just because it's situational doesn't mean that that's also, excuses it, but it's easier, maybe it's easier to understand if you've made at least that decision, that it's not related to a person's disposition or personality. It's more related to the situation in which they find themselves. And in school settings, very often we find people in a curriculum setting or an instructional setting that they're not really prepared for. Or we're implementing a new curriculum or instructional model for which they have not been trained for. And that doesn't mean they don't want to do it. It just means it's situational because they don't want to look stupid. And if you're trying to do something that you haven't been trained for, it's real easy to look inept and stupid. When it's not a matter of disposition, it's just a matter of, I don't have any real training for this. Yeah. And so that idea of when there's an issue of attributing it, and it's basic human nature, by the way. I mean, that's the little genetic mutation, a few 100,000 years ago that created this species that we're a part of, that has to always attribute cause and effect. If we see something happen, we have to figure out why. I mean, we have to understand why. Well, that why can lead you sometimes to make a bad read. And the bad read can be on an individual that it's more dispositional, when it's not really. It's a situational thing. And maybe if you correct the situation, then the person comes back around, or comes around, and it's a student in a classroom. Yeah. Could be the same thing. Sometimes it's not, they just don't want to work. Sometimes it's they just don't want to fail. And that's a different thing. And so to avoid errors of attribution, you have to always collect as much data as you can, or is available, to figure out what's going on, and then you can reasonably go about trying to deal with it. And this kind of goes back, Sam, what you were talking about earlier, that my comments about that some of your data may not be as useful as some other data. And so you have to kind of look at data that way too. What's the good data here that will help me understand what's going on. But those are some things that a lot of it comes through experience, but a lot of it comes through stepping back and taking a breath and figuring out what might be going on here, and collecting data. Any of you have any experience or have had that happen to you, or have done that in a classroom, or done that working with others? Let's see. Brooke, don't you work with your background's kind of instructional leadership, or did I hear that the other
It
day?
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Have you ever worked with a teacher and had to figure out, what was going on with them before you could really get them going the right way?
Yes, and I think also there's a lot of emotional things that
Yeah.
you have to
Yeah.
figure out, and a lot of times it's not necessarily, you have to find out if it's skill versus will. A lot of times we think that they don't want to do it, but like you said, sometimes they don't have the skill, and because they don't have the skill, they seem to resist. But it's because that they just don't know it.
Yeah.
How to do it and that kind of thing. And a lot of it is now, especially, we're looking at coaching with emotions. There's a lot of extraneous stuff going on that we kind of have to get through to the root cause of things.
Yeah, and with the level of trauma that you're going to be seeing in buildings, not only among students, but among staff too. I mean, staff are going through trauma right now. I mean, I don't know about you, but I lost a sister-in-law and a couple of uncles and a couple of cousins, distant cousins, and so I have flashes every now and then. I wonder what so and so with that. Oh, it doesn't matter because they're dead. And so you deal with trauma. Maybe you can handle a little bit better than maybe some of your kids can. They may embed it a little bit deeper, but there is always that emotional context, and there is that trauma related emotional context too, because everybody's on an edge. Now we're getting a little bit better about that because I think we can kind of think maybe we see the other side of it, but you know, the end of the tunnel sort of thing. But until we actually get there, we'll be kind of on that emotional edge. And so, you know, understanding why people do what they do is kind of, yeah, that's a fool's errand anyhow. But at least you can do is you know, collect as much information as you can and be as sure as you can about your, you know, your solution or your thought process, because otherwise you do run afoul of that whole attribution thing. And it's a hard one. It's a tough one for people moving into building leadership to kind of get a good handle on. And that's why, you know, yeah, one of the principals I worked with fairly long time. I mean, I worked with him for 8 or 10 years in a building that we were trying to do school improvement in, and got him turned around. And I worked with him off and on, you know, probably 8 or 10 years. And what what Joe really had as had developed as a model is that every day, you know, about mid morning, late morning, you know, just when things maybe the uproar has calmed down a little bit in the office, he'd close the door and he would just do his 20-minute, half-hour meditation. And you know, what he was doing was not, you know, Eastern mystical meditation. He was just kind of thinking through decisions he had made and decisions he needed to make, and, you know, circumstances he needed to deal with, and taking a breath, you know, catching a breath and stepping back a little bit and thinking about, okay, well, okay, I guess I need to approach this and like that. And, you know, that he became a very, very effective building principal because he understood that, you know, you can make a lot of decisions on the fly, and the decisions you make on the fly are almost always going to have maybe a little bit more of an emotional content. And so it's a little bit, it was better for him. It might not work for everybody, but work for him, but never worked for me, is to, you know, he just had to sit down and put his heels up and, you know, close the door and do his little meditative 20 minutes or half an hour. And then he was ready to go. And he always felt better about the rest of the day, and he always felt better about his decisions. And, you know, he didn't make a whole lot of mistakes. Everybody's gonna make mistakes, but he didn't make a whole lot. And that was kind of his angle. It was what he, you know, where he got the idea from. His wife was a cop. And every day when it was lunchtime, she didn't eat lunch with the rest of the cops. She found a little corner office or something, and she would just go in and close the door and turn on a little meditation thing, and she'd meditate for 20 minutes. And, you know, in 15 years on a police force, she never had a complaint against her. But, you know, I guess as long as you didn't mess with her first thing in the morning, you were okay. But by the time she got her lunch meditation in, she was good and she was fine. So she told her husband, she said, you ought to try that. And he did. And be darned if it didn't work for him too. And so it was kind of an interesting thing. Here's another one. Yeah, he went through a real bad bout of COVID and was on a ventilator for 3 or 4 days, and he made it through. He came out the other side, but he, you know, it was another one of those trauma sort of issues, elements that you have to deal with. Other thoughts about environmental scans, about this Pygmalion thing or this attribution thing or any of that stuff? Okay. What is it? 5:46. So we've been here 46 minutes. Okay. One of the things that I want to do as we kind of talk about these models of leadership is, you know, to focus on kind of the role of theory in things. And I know you've been, if you've read the text material, you've been reading, some information about theory and the theory to practice sort of idea, and thinking about how do you take these sort of theories about things and turn it into sort of practical strategic moves. So, what when you hear the term theory, what comes to mind? How do you define it? What is a theory?
In a theory, just a well-tested hypothesis. I mean, if you want to be scientific about it.
Yeah, but it's a little bit more than that. Where does the hypothesis come from?
A question?
Yeah, it comes from a question, but there's stuff in between that. The others. What? Let's see if we can put this thing together. Others. What's a theory?
I was going to say, I don't even think it's as good as what Justin said, but I was just going to say a set of ideas on how to approach something.
That's a good starting point. It's a good
I
starting.
think there needs to be like an identified need, like I guess what Justin was saying, like the question maybe.
Yeah, a question. Other bits and pieces?
I think it's almost an explanation based off of observations and research that you should be able to apply to any situation, or should help you make a prediction about an outcome. Or I think that's it.
Okay, yeah. Kind of guiding principles or guiding sorts of ideas that spring from a theory. I mean, all these things are I think are bits and pieces of the notion of a theory. Yeah, it's an idea, but idea is just an opinion until you have evidence, well tested, until you have evidence. But you have to have a framework within which to test the evidence, to identify evidence and test the evidence. I mean, theories lead to guidelines, or to principles, or to, let's say we're talking about math and science, they lead to axioms and, assumptions and things like that. But there has to be, without all of that testing sort of process, there has to be, it's just an opinion. And so a theory has to have some guiding principles to it. For example, the constructivism notion that Vygotsky gets into. I mean, Vygotsky is, he's a constructivist, but he also he also hypothesized about leadership, and he talked about leadership as being entirely from the people being led. That whoever is the leader draws their principles and their thoughts from the people being led, as opposed to imposing something on them. They draw from them, and so it's very participative. And so the guiding principle in it is that it's drawn from the situations and the personalities and the people that are being led. Now, I'm not sure that all people would buy into that. There are other theories of leadership that are much more directed. It's kind of the top-down thing. There's that whole category of leadership principles that are what we call servant leaders, which is a little bit more less participative than Vygotsky's notion of everything coming from the participants. And so you have different thoughts about leadership, different theories about leadership. The rule of thumb is that they're all a theory, unless they generate a hypothesis that you can then test. And so the notion of a theory is that you have to be able to collect evidence and test it. Now, as a burgeoning school leader, I'm not so sure that you really have a real firm notion of what your leadership style is going to be, because you have to test it under fire. You have to be in that situation, a little bit of Vygotsky, to understand how other people will respond to the initiative that you may put forth. And so you can't really know what works for you until you have a chance to test it. Now, this is above and apart the leadership modes, because that's an entirely different thing. That's, leadership modes are related to the type of challenge within the building or within the group you're leading. Some of those challenges are transformative, some are instructional, some are adaptive. And so you have to be able to lead in all those different circumstances. But the style you bring to that, the leadership style and theory you bring to that, is important. And so whether you believe in theory X or theory Y, or theory X and Y, or Vygotsky's constructivism, or the servant leadership model, or whatever, you have to go in and understand those things at really a level that you can't be taught. You have to kind of get your own mind around what that looks like and what would it lead you to do in a given circumstance, and see how that works. And you will screw up a fair amount. Everybody does. Hopefully you don't screw up as much as you gain experience. If you do, then you might think about another career path, but hopefully you get better. And I'm sure some of you have had the opportunity, I'll say it that way. You've had the opportunity to work for people that you couldn't figure out what their leadership style was because it was erratic. And you can't lead in a way that's not consistent with who you are, because it has to come from inside out. Now, give me an example. I was talking to a couple of students the other day about kind of this very thing, and they were talking about this one doc student had been in 2 different schools, and they were in a community, and the demographics of the community were very, very similar, the 2 different schools. And one of them, looking at their environmental scan, seemed to have a higher per pupil dollar available to work with students than the other one. And there are 2 schools kind of in the same community, about the same size, about the same, makeup. And so what makes a difference? Well, the big difference was the school that had more per dollar and seemed to be a more stable school had a teacher, had a principal that she understood the need to work within the community and build a base of power, if you want to call it that. I don't like that term, but build a base of support within the community that would allow them to advocate for more resource, but would also allow them to generate more resource that's not coming from the school system. And the other school had a school leader that was pretty good within the building, but really didn't like being out among the community and didn't like meeting with parents and things like that. And so, yeah, who's going to go to the supervisors meeting and say, we need more money for such and such, or we more, you know, it's just not going to happen. And the business community is not going to respond to them when they put out a lot of requests to say, you know, I really need money to help with this. Well, if they don't know them and they don't have, you know, a trust level for them, that's not coming. That's not forthcoming. And so the difference between the two schools was not the demographic and not the programs within the schools. It was the leader in the school and their comfort level with working in the community. Because here's a flash, you will never have enough money in your budget. You'll always have a longer wish list than you'll have a resource list. And you'll never get enough money from the school system and from the state. You're going to need resources from the community. And so, you know, that was a difference. That person, you know, the first person didn't feel comfortable doing that. And, you know, the other person did. And that was the difference between a school that was right on the top of the top form, top ladder, and a school that was somewhere down in the middle. One meeting potential, one not meeting potential. And so there are, you know, things like that, that as you get, you know, older, more experienced and start to engage in the community a little bit more, if you don't do that already, then you'll figure some things out. Yeah. But it is, you know, you have to figure out your leadership style, how it's consistent with you, who you are, and what you need to get better at. Yeah, I mentioned last time, you know, the little journal notion or whatever. That's not a bad idea. I mean, you can have your little journal and you can hide it where nobody else can see it, and, you know, kind of reflect back on it. But you ought to be looking at those things that you think are deficits in your skill set or in your, you know, interpersonal relationship with the community or whatever, and begin to get better at those. You know, have a strategy to get better at those. Because you can, you know, it can have a great impact on the success of the building you lead. Doesn't matter if you're really good at all those things that you need to be good at in the building, if you don't have, you know, that extra dimension beyond that point. One of the first positions that private schools fill, or non-public schools, is the advancement position. Courtney, your advancement.
Sorry, my baby's looking out the window. So
Okay.
I was waving.
I thought you were advancement. I was going, oh God, somebody in here is advancement. I hope I haven't, you know. But yeah, I mean, your private schools always fill their advancement role. And I think somebody was talking about the other day about the, what was it, NC 64 program in their community. That was a group of businesses in the community that had been organized by someone that was a technology teacher in the community because he needed some equipment. And he went out and talked to some of the businesses and he got them interested. And then he got his superintendent on it, and his superintendent, anybody in this room know Larry Stover, superintendent? We got Larry going on it, and Larry got,
Matt Stover.
What's that?
Matt Stover.
Matt Stover, yeah. Larry is, I always get him and one other guy mixed up because they kind of remind me of the same. They're two guys I had in class. And you know, if I saw them, I would tell you which one was which, but names are kind of like, you know, forget about it. Not in my skill set to remember names. But they, you know, he got the community college going on a partnership. And their school system and the community college got a group of businesses together in the area. And now they have about 20, 25 businesses in the area. And when they have needs within the buildings, within the school buildings, they bring it to this group, and this group raises money from these businesses and matches up these needs to particular groups of businesses. And the business guys, the businessmen and women do this because that's their workforce. And they know if they don't have that workforce, their bottom line is going to suffer. And so they're more than willing to bring some resources to the table. They don't have time to be picked to death by, you know, 10 different schools wanting something. And so if you're in that area, you run it through that conglomerate and they put it out there and they see if anybody's interested in helping. And so it is it's a model, but it is an important component piece because you do have to have that extra resource. You just don't have enough money come in the regular supply chain to do all the things you want to do. Any thoughts or questions about that notion or any of those notions related to leadership? Okay. 6:03. We're going to take a break until 6:15. We're going to come back, and then at 6:15, we're going to talk about a little bit about strategic planning and get that discussion going. We probably won't have time to get fully through that because I hate doing coursework that's more than a couple of hours in one of these sessions. I think that's just foolish, stupid to do, and not done best virtually that way anyhow. So we'll come back at 6:15. We'll launch ourselves on a little bit of discussion on strategic planning, strategic development, that sort of thing. Get that started, and then we will cut that at some point. Come back, kind of make sure that we are clear on the assignment having to do with next week with the group work, with the asynchronous work, and then call it quits, call it a night. Any questions before we take a quick break? All right, I'll be back about 6:15, 6:20, somewhere in that range. Okay. All right. See you in a minute.